the architect of war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Nagato, gazing across the gray waters of Hiroshima Bay. The morning mist clung to the surface like ghosts unwilling to depart, and in that moment he felt an unsettling kinship with those phantoms. At 57 years old, he had become the architect of what would be Japan's most audacious military operation. Yet doubt gnawed at his soul like a persistent rat. He had spent years in America, walking the streets of Harvard, observing the industrial might of a nation that seemed to manufacture destiny itself. The oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automotive factories of Detroit. These were not merely economic enterprises, but the beating heart of a colossus. His colleagues in the Imperial Japanese Navy saw America as soft, weakened by democracy, and distracted by pleasure. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen the sleeping giant, and he understood that waking it would be catastrophic. Yet here he stood, having meticulously planned Operation Z, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The plan was brilliant in its conception. 6 aircraft carriers, over 300 aircraft, striking at dawn to cripple the American Pacific Fleet before they could respond. His staff officers celebrated the strategy as a masterstroke that would give Japan dominance in the Pacific for years to come. But Yamamoto felt no joy, only the cold weight of inevitability. The decision had not been his alone. The civilian government, dominated by militarists and nationalists, had chosen the path of war. When economic sanctions had strangled Japan's access to oil and steel, the military leadership saw no option but expansion into Southeast Asia. And that expansion would inevitably bring conflict with America. Yamamoto had argued for diplomacy, for patience, for anything but this reckless gamble. His words had fallen on deaf ears. Now, as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, it was his duty to execute the will of his nation, even if he believed that it was misguided. The attack would succeed, of that he was certain. His pilots were the best in the world, trained to perfection. The element of surprise would be absolute. The American battleships anchored in their neat rows at Pearl Harbor would burn. But then what? Yamamoto pulled his coat tighter against the morning chill. He had done the calculations 100 times. Japan might dominate the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year. But America would rebuild, and when it did, its industrial capacity would unleash a fury that Japan could never match. He had told the Prime Minister that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. His words had been noted and dismissed. Commander Genda approached, bowing respectfully. "Admiral, the final preparations are complete. Vice Admiral Nagumo reports that the strike force will be ready to sail on November 26. The diplomatic negotiations in Washington continue, giving us perfect cover." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "And the pilots? Their morale?" "Excellent, sir. They are eager to strike a blow for the Empire. They believe this attack will bring America to the negotiating table, force them to accept Japan's rightful place in Asia." "Do you believe that, Genda?" The younger officer hesitated, sensing the trap in the question. "I believe, sir, that we will execute our mission flawlessly." "That is not what I asked." Genda met his admiral's eyes. "I believe, sir, that we will do our duty." Yamamoto turned back to the sea. Duty? It was a word that could justify anything, even folly. In 2 weeks, the strike force would sail north, taking a route to the empty North Pacific where no merchant ships traveled. They would maintain absolute radio silence. They would arrive undetected at their launch point, 200 miles north of Oahu. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning, they would change the course of history. He whispered to the wind, words he could never speak aloud to his subordinates. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The die is cast. The carrier Akagi pitched gently in the swells as Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood in the operations room, studying the chart spread before him. November 26 had arrived, and with it, the point of no return. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with their escorts, were about to embark on a journey that would either secure Japan's empire or doom it to destruction. Nagumo was a battleship admiral at heart, a man who believed in the power of massive guns and thick armor. This business with carriers and aircraft struck him as unproven, almost cowardly. But Yamamoto had designed this operation, and Yamamoto was the finest strategic mind in the Navy. If the Admiral said it would work, then Nagumo would execute the plan with precision, even if his soul rebelled against it. The operational orders were clear. Proceed to a position designated as Point X, northwest of Hawaii. Launch aircraft at dawn on December 7th, a Sunday when the Americans would be least alert. Destroy the battleships anchored in Pearl Harbor. Cripple the American Pacific Fleet. Return to Japan victorious. Simple words that concealed enormous complexity and risk. Captain Fukuda Mitsuo, who would lead the air attack, entered the operations room with barely contained excitement. "Sir, the pilots are ready. We have reviewed the reconnaissance photographs 100 times. We know every berth, every building, every defensive position. The Americans suspect nothing. And if they do suspect," Nagumo asked, "if their carriers are waiting for us? If their submarines detect us during our approach?" Fukuda's confidence never wavered. "Then we destroy them too, sir. Our pilots are the best in the world. We have trained for years for this moment. The Americans have grown soft in their peace." Nagumo wanted to believe such certainty. He had seen the intelligence reports about American military readiness, or the lack thereof. The U.S. Army and Navy in Hawaii conducted their operations on a peacetime schedule. They anchored their precious battleships in neat, photogenic rows every weekend. Their fighter aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip on airfields, easy targets to prevent sabotage from local Japanese residents. Their radar stations operated sporadically. Security was lax. It was almost too perfect, which made Nagumo suspicious. Could the Americans really be so complacent? Or was this an elaborate trap? Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto wrestled with similar doubts. He had received the latest intelligence from the embassy in Washington. Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu were still negotiating with Secretary of State Hull, discussing terms that both sides knew were unacceptable. Japan would not withdraw from China. America would not lift its oil embargo. The diplomatic dance was merely theater, a distraction while the real drama unfolded across the Pacific. Yamamoto lit a cigarette, a habit he had acquired during his time in America, and studied the map of the Pacific on his wall. Each island, each shipping route, each strategic position was marked with care. He could see the whole chessboard, and what he saw terrified him. Even if Pearl Harbor succeeded beyond all expectations, what then? Japan would secure oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. They would create what the propagandists call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But they would also create an enemy that would never forgive, never forget, and never stop until Japan was crushed. His aide, Lieutenant Yamaguchi, brought fresh intelligence reports. "Sir, our agents report that the American carriers Enterprise and Lexington are not currently at Pearl Harbor. They are on training exercises. The Saratoga is on the west coast." Yamamoto's hand froze halfway to the ashtray. The carriers were gone. The most dangerous weapons in the American arsenal would not be present during the attack. In one sense, this made the operation safer. There would be no carrier-based aircraft to threaten Nagumo's strike force. But in another sense, it was a disaster. The carriers were the future of naval warfare. Sinking obsolete battleships would be a symbolic victory, but leaving American carriers intact was a strategic failure. He considered sending new orders to Nagumo, delay the attack, wait for the carriers to return to port. But the diplomatic clock was ticking. The strike force was already approaching the point where fuel constraints would make return impossible, and the risk of discovery increased with every passing day. No, the attack would proceed as planned. They would destroy what they could and hope that the shock would bring America to terms. It was a desperate hope, Yamamoto knew, but it was all they had left. In his private moments, Yamamoto remembered his time at Harvard, remembered American friends who had welcomed him warmly. He thought of baseball games and jazz music, of endless debates about democracy and destiny. Those Americans had been generous, optimistic, certain of their nation's greatness. They had been right to be certain. "Lieutenant," Yamamoto said quietly, "draft a message to Vice Admiral Nagumo. Tell him that the operation is approved to proceed, but include this personal note. Execute your mission with honor, but remember that we are not striking an inferior enemy. We are striking a giant who will not rest until we are destroyed." Yamaguchi bowed. "Sir, such a message might undermine morale. Send it anyway. Nagumo should know the truth, even if others do not." As his aide departed, Yamamoto turned again to the map. Somewhere out there, Nagumo's task force was slicing through cold northern waters, racing toward destiny. And here in Tokyo, all Yamamoto could do was wait, smoke, and contemplate the magnitude of his mistake. The silence before the storm. Commander Minoru Genda stood on the pitching deck of the Akagi, watching the gray sky merge with the gray sea until no horizon existed, only an infinity of cold emptiness. It was December 5th, and the strike force had maintained perfect radio silence for 9 days. Not a single transmission, not a careless word. They were ghosts sliding to the North Pacific, a route so desolate that they had encountered not a single ship, not even a fishing vessel. The weather had been their ally. Heavy clouds and rough seas kept them concealed from any aircraft that might have ventured this far north. The men were exhausted from the constant pitching of the vessels, from the cold that penetrated even the best winter gear, from the tension of knowing that discovery would mean the mission's failure and possibly their deaths. Genda had been one of the principal architects of the attack plan, working closely with Yamamoto to refine every detail. He believed in carrier aviation with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. The battleship admirals could keep their floating fortresses. The future belonged to aircraft that could strike from beyond visual range, that could destroy an enemy before he even knew battle had been joined. Yet even Genda felt the weight of what they were about to do. He had studied at American naval colleges, had friends among the officers of the U.S. Navy. Professional respect had grown into genuine friendship. Now, he was sailing toward those friends with the intent to kill them. It was war, he told himself. Honor demanded that he set aside personal feelings and serve his nation. But honor felt cold comfort on this gray morning. Captain Fukuda found him at the rail. "Commander, the latest meteorological report. The weather will clear over Hawaii tomorrow. Conditions will be perfect for the attack. And the Americans? Any sign they have detected us?" "Nothing. Radio intercepts from Hawaii indicate normal peacetime operations. Their commercial radio stations broadcast music and news. Everything is normal. They suspect nothing." Genda nodded, but unease twisted in his gut. It seems impossible that they could be so blind. We are about to strike their main naval base with 6 carriers and over 300 aircraft, and they notice nothing. Perhaps, Fukuda said carefully, they believe themselves invincible. They think the ocean protects them. They cannot imagine that Japan would dare attack American territory directly. Or perhaps, Genda replied, they simply do not believe war is truly coming. Diplomacy continues in Washington. From their perspective, why would we negotiate if we plan to attack? Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto was receiving troubling news from Washington. Ambassador Nomura had requested an urgent meeting with Secretary Hull for December 7th at 1 p.m. Washington time. He would deliver Japan's final response to American demands, effectively a declaration that negotiations had failed. But 1 p.m. in Washington was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. The attack would begin before the diplomatic note was delivered. Yamamoto had specifically ordered that the note be presented before the attack commenced. Japan would not be guilty of attacking without warning, of striking like an assassin in the night. But the Foreign Ministry had bungled the timing. The 14-part message was being delivered too slowly to the embassy. It would need to be decoded and translated. The meeting with Hull would occur after the bombs began falling. "This is unacceptable," Yamamoto said to his staff. "We will be branded as treacherous, as pirates. This will give the Americans even more reason to fight, to our complete destruction." His chief of staff, Admiral Igaki, replied carefully, "Sir, the diplomatic failure changes nothing. The attack will proceed. We will achieve strategic surprise. Perhaps it is even better this way. We will not give them even a moment's warning to prepare." "You are thinking like a tactician, not a strategist," Yamamoto snapped. "Yes, we will achieve surprise. Yes, we will sink their battleships. But we will also unite their nation in a fury that will never be quenched. They will not rest until Japan is ashes. Then what would you have us do, sir? Recall the task force? It is too late. We are committed. Yamamoto stared at the map of the Pacific. I know we are committed, but I fear we have committed ourselves to national suicide. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, ordinary life continued in Hawaii. In Honolulu, families prepared for church on Sunday. On the airfields, mechanics serviced aircraft, looking forward to a quiet weekend. In the barracks, young sailors and soldiers planned their shore leave, thinking about girls and beer and escape from military routine. Aboard the battleships USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS California, USS West Virginia, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, USS Nevada, and USS Pennsylvania, crews settled into the peaceful rhythm of weekend duty. None of them knew that 6 carriers were positioned 230 miles to their north. None of them imagined that in less than 48 hours, many of them would be dead. None of them understood that they stood at the pivot point of history, the moment when the world would shift from one age to another. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of a U.S. Pacific Fleet, reviewed intelligence reports in his headquarters. There had been indicators of Japanese military movements, but nothing conclusive. The Japanese had recalled their merchant vessels from the Pacific, suggesting that war might be imminent. But war where? Most analysts predicted attacks on the Philippines or Malaya. Hawaii seemed too far, too well defended, too risky. Besides, war seemed unlikely. Negotiations were continuing in Washington. Surely the Japanese would not negotiate in bad faith while simultaneously planning a surprise attack that would violate every norm of civilized conduct. Kimmel approved a routine schedule for December 7th. The fleet would be in port as it was every weekend. Aircraft would be grouped together to prevent sabotage. Minimal defensive patrols would be flown. Everything normal, everything safe. As the sun set on December 6th, 2 worlds existed in blissful ignorance of each other. In Hawaii, Americans prepared for a peaceful Sunday. In the cold North Pacific, Japanese pilots readied their aircraft for the most devastating surprise attack in naval history. And in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto smoked cigarettes and waited for news that would confirm his darkest fears. Dawn of infamy. The alarm on the Akagi shrieked at 3:30 a.m. on December 7th. Captain Fukuda was already awake, too tense for sleep. He dressed quickly in his flight suit, then added the white hachimaki headband that marked him as flight leader. Today would be the most important day of his life, the day when he would lead Japan to victory or to disaster. On the flight decks of 6 carriers, crews worked frantically to prepare aircraft. Mechanics made final checks of engines. Armament crews loaded torpedoes and bombs. Pilots reviewed their targets one last time, memorizing the layout of Pearl Harbor, the positions of battleships, the locations of airfields and fuel depots. The weather had cleared miraculously. Stars glittered overhead, and the sea had calmed to gentle swells. It was as if the gods themselves blessed the operation. At 6 a.m., Fukuda climbed into his Nakajima B-5 N2 bomber, his observer and radio man settling in behind him. All around him, engines roared to life, filling the dawn with thunder. Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, watching the organized chaos of the launch. He still felt the weight of doubt, but his duty was clear. Signal to all ships, commence attack operations. Fukuda's aircraft rolled down the pitching deck and lifted into the air, followed by wave after wave of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. In total, 183 aircraft in the first wave, with another 167 prepared for the second wave. It was the largest carrier strike in history, and it was aimed at an enemy that had no idea they were coming. As Fukuda's formation flew south toward Oahu, he thought about the significance of what they were doing. Below them, the ocean looked peaceful in the early morning light. Ahead, Hawaii still slumbered, unaware that war was minutes away. He felt no hatred for the Americans, only the cold determination of a professional warrior executing his orders. At 7:40 a.m., Fukuda saw the northern coast of Oahu emerge from the dawn haze. The island looked exactly like the reconnaissance photographs, the distinctive shape of Diamond Head, the urban sprawl of Honolulu, the military installations of Pearl Harbor, and best of all, No fighters rose to meet them. No anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Complete surprise had been achieved. Fukuda transmitted the coded signal. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The signal that surprise had been achieved. On the Akagi, Nagumo received a message with grim satisfaction. Whatever happened next, they had succeeded in the most difficult part of the operation. At 7:53 a.m., the first bombs fell on Wheeler Field, the main fighter base in central Oahu. American P. 40 fighters exploded in neat rows, precisely as predicted. At the same moment, torpedo bombers swept into Pearl Harbor at wave-top height, threading between the ships to launch their torpedoes at the battleships. The modified aerial torpedoes ran true in the shallow water, slamming into the hulls of Oklahoma and West Virginia. The surprise was total, catastrophic. For 15 precious minutes, American forces couldn't respond effectively. Men stumbled from barracks, unsure if this was a drill or reality. Officers tried to reach their posts. Ammunition lockers remained locked because no one had the keys readily available. It was chaos, exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. But even in chaos, heroism emerged. On the Nevada, an ensign ordered steam rays and attempted to get the battleship underway. On the Arizona, gunners manned their anti-aircraft batteries, despite the inferno engulfing their ship. At Hickam Field, pilots ran to their aircraft through strafing fire, determined to get airborne and fight back. Fukuda directed his bombers over Battleship Row, watching with professional detachment as torpedo after torpedo struck home. The Oklahoma capsized in minutes, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. The West Virginia settled to the bottom, her decks awash. The California took multiple torpedo hits and began to sink. The Tennessee and Maryland, moored inboard of other vessels, sustained bomb damage but remained afloat. And then came the moment that would define the attack. At 8:10 a.m., a 1,760-pound bomb penetrated the forward magazine of the USS Arizona. The explosion was catastrophic, a pillar of fire and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. The battleship's entire forward section disintegrated. In an instant, over 1,000 men died, vaporized, or drowned, or burned alive. Fukuda watched the Arizona's destruction with horror and awe. He had planned for success, but the reality of such devastation shocked him. Below, the harbor was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. Ships burning, oil spreading across the water and catching fire, men jumping into the inferno to escape their sinking vessels. The second wave arrived at 8:40 a.m., adding to the carnage. By now, American defenses had organized somewhat. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, and a few American fighters managed to get airborne. But it was too little, too late. The Japanese aircraft bombed and strafed at will, destroying aircraft on ground, hitting shore installations, adding to the destruction of the Battleship Row. By 10 a.m., it was over. The Japanese aircraft withdrew, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable destruction. 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged, for would never sail again. Over 180 aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans were dead, with over 1,100 wounded. It was the worst military disaster in American history. On the Akagi, Fukuda landed his bomber and immediately climbed a bridge to brief Nagumo. "Sir, the attack succeeded beyond our expectations. The American battleship force has been destroyed. We should launch a third wave to destroy their fuel storage and repair facilities." But Nagumo shook his head. "No, we have accomplished our mission. The American carriers were not in port. They remain a threat. We will withdraw before they can locate and attack us." Fukuda argued passionately, but Nagumo was adamant. They had achieved a great victory, but the risk of remaining in range of American counterattack was too great. The strike force turned north, racing away from Hawaii toward the safety of Japanese waters. In Tokyo, Yamamoto received the initial reports with a mixture of pride and dread. The attack had succeeded perfectly. Japan had dealt America a devastating blow. The naval balance in the Pacific had shifted dramatically in Japan's favor. But as he studied the detailed reports, his dread deepened. The American carriers had not been present. The fuel storage facilities remained intact. The repair yards were still operational. And most importantly, America was now united in fury, determined to avenge this day of infamy, as their president would soon call it. Yamamoto had achieved a brilliant tactical victory, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had made a strategic error from which Japan would never recover. The realization. 3 days after the attack, Admiral Yamamoto sat alone in his office aboard the Nagato, reading intelligence reports with growing dismay. The tactical results had been spectacular. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, numerous aircraft destroyed, American naval power in the Pacific crippled. The Emperor had been pleased. The General Staff celebrated a historic victory. Public morale soared. Japan seemed invincible. But Yamamoto saw past the celebration to the deeper truth. He had spent years in America, had studied American history and psychology, had come to understand American character in ways his colleagues never bothered to attempt. And what he understood filled him with dread. The intelligence reports confirmed his fears. America had not sued for peace. President Roosevelt had given a speech to Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress had declared war with only one dissenting vote. But more than the formal declarations, it was the national mood that terrified Yamamoto. America had unified overnight. The isolationists who had resisted involvement in foreign wars fell silent. The peace activists who had marched against military spending now demanded vengeance. Labor unions pledged not to strike. Corporations promised to convert their factories to war production. Young men lined up at recruitment centers in numbers that overwhelmed the system. A nation of 130 million people, with the world's largest economy and most advanced industry, had committed itself to total war. "We have awakened the sleeping giant," Yamamoto muttered to himself, "and he is filled with a terrible resolve." His aide, Commander Watanabe, entered with more reports. "Sir, additional reconnaissance from Hawaii indicates that our estimates of American losses were accurate. However, the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port and remain operational. Our agents report intensive salvage operations in Pearl Harbor. The Americans are already beginning to raise their sunken vessels." Yamamoto closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his mistake. The carriers. "We sank obsolete battleships while the weapons of the future escaped us. And the Americans will rebuild. They will build more carriers, more aircraft, more of everything. Their industrial capacity is 10 times ours." "But, sir," Watanabe protested, "we control the Pacific now. We have 6 months, perhaps a year, to consolidate our position, to build our defensive perimeter, to make ourselves invincible." Invincible? Yamamoto's laugh was bitter. "We have made ourselves a target of American fury. Do you understand what that means? I have seen American factories, American oil fields, American farms. They are a nation that can fight a war on the other side of the world and never feel privation at home. They will build 100 ships for every one we build. They will train 100 pilots for every pilot we train. And they will not stop until Japan is destroyed." In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction began to prove accurate. American industry mobilized with astonishing speed. Factories that had produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had been nearly idle now worked around the clock, building destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. Women entered the workforce by the millions, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men. President Roosevelt called for production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. The Japanese General Staff scoffed at these numbers as propaganda, impossible fantasies. Yamamoto did not scoff. He knew the Americans would achieve these goals and exceed them. Meanwhile, Japan's own industrial capacity strained under wartime demands. The oil from the Dutch East Indies had to be transported thousands of miles to Japanese refineries, running a gauntlet of American submarines. Steel production was limited. Aircraft manufacturing could not keep pace with losses. And most critically, pilot training programs could not replace experienced aviators fast enough. Yamamoto called a meeting with his senior staff. "Gentlemen, I must speak frankly. The attack on Pearl Harbor, while tactically successful, was a strategic disaster. We have united our enemy and provoked a conflict we cannot win. Admiral Agaki objected immediately. Sir, we have destroyed the American battle fleet. We control the Pacific. How can you call this a disaster? Because we have not destroyed their will to fight, Yamamoto replied. If we had sunk every battleship, every carrier, every aircraft in their possession, they would simply build more. America's strength is not in its military, which was small and unprepared. America's strength is in its industry, its resources, its population, and now, its unified determination to crush us. Then what do you propose? Asked Admiral Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike force. I propose that we recognize reality, Yamamoto said. We have perhaps 6 months before American production begins to overwhelm us. In that time, we must achieve our objectives in Southeast Asia, secure the oil, the rubber, the resources we need. Then we must build a defensive perimeter so strong that the Americans will exhaust themselves against it. Perhaps, if we make the cost high enough, they will agree to a negotiated peace. But even as he spoke, Yamamoto knew it was a desperate hope. He had seen the American newspapers, filled with images of Pearl Harbor burning. He had read the speeches, calling for unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. He understood that America would accept nothing less than total victory, no matter how long it took or how many lives it cost. In quiet moments, Yamamoto reflected on the hubris that had led Japan to this point. His nation had believed its own propaganda about spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantage. They had convinced themselves that American democracy was weakness, that Americans loved comfort too much to endure hardship, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. These were dangerous delusions, and Yamamoto had tried to warn against them. But militarists and nationalists had controlled policy, and they had been determined to expand Japan's empire regardless of consequences. Yamamoto had been forced to implement a strategy he knew was flawed, to attack an enemy he knew could not be defeated. As December turned to January, Japanese forces continued to advance in Southeast Asia. Hong Kong fell. Manila fell. Singapore would fall soon. The newsreels showed triumph after triumph. But Yamamoto saw past the victories to the future they had made inevitable. America was building. America was training. America was preparing vengeance. And when that vengeance came, it would be total, unstoppable, and devastating. He had planned the Pearl Harbor attack perfectly, executed it flawlessly, and achieved complete tactical surprise. And in doing so, he had condemned his nation to destruction. The long shadow. By mid-1942, Yamamoto's darkest predictions were beginning to materialize. The Battle of the Coral Sea may have been tactically inconclusive, but strategically significant. It was the first time Japanese expansion had been checked. Then came Midway in June, where 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single day. The irreplaceable heart of Japan's naval air power, destroyed in minutes by American dive bombers. Yamamoto had opposed the Midway operation, arguing that it was an unnecessary risk. But the Naval General Staff, intoxicated by 6 months of unbroken victory, had overruled him. They wanted to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. They got their battle, and it was decisive, decisively in America's favor. Standing on the bridge of the Yamato, Japan's largest and most powerful battleship, Yamamoto read the casualty reports from Midway. 4 carriers lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of experienced pilots dead. It was a blow from which Japan's naval air power would never recover. The war is lost, Yamamoto said to his chief of staff. Midway has sealed our fate. Surely not, sir, Admiral Agaki protested. We still have carriers. We still control a vast empire. We can rebuild. With what? Yamamoto asked. American factories are producing aircraft faster than we can train pilots to fly them. American shipyards are launching new carriers every month. American submarines are strangling our supply lines. Every tanker of oil we bring from the Dutch East Indies runs a gauntlet of torpedoes. Every transport of resources faces the same threat. We are being slowly strangled, and there is nothing we can do to stop it. The strategic situation continued to deteriorate. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign that would drain Japan's remaining strength. Every reinforcement sent to the island was intercepted. Every supply convoy was attacked. Japanese soldiers starved on the island, while American supplies flowed in without interruption. Yamamoto committed his forces to supporting Guadalcanal. Knowing it was a battle Japan could not afford to lose, but probably could not win. Night after night, naval battles raged in the waters off the island. Japan won some engagements, lost others, but the overall trend was clear. American forces were learning, adapting, growing stronger. Japanese forces were being ground down, worn away, exhausted. In his private correspondence with trusted colleagues, Yamamoto expressed his growing despair. I told him before the war that I could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but I had no confidence after that. It has been barely more than a year since Pearl Harbor, and already we are on the defensive. American production is overwhelming us. Their code breakers are reading our messages. Their submarines are sinking our merchant fleet, and their fury remains undiminished. The statistics confirmed his assessment. In 1942, American shipyards produced more than 8 million tons of shipping. Merchant vessels, warships, landing craft. Japan managed less than 1 million tons. American aircraft production reached 47,000 planes. Japan produced 9,000. The disparity was staggering and growing wider every month. In Tokyo, the government still spoke of final victory, of the invincible Japanese spirit overcoming material disadvantage. But Yamamoto knew better. Spirit could not sink submarines. Bravery could not produce oil. Determination could not manufacture aircraft engines. Japan was fighting a modern industrial war with insufficient industry, and the outcome was inevitable. Yet duty demanded that he continue fighting, continue trying to defend the empire he had helped create. Yamamoto planned operations, moved his forces, sought any advantage that might delay the inevitable. But in quiet moments, he reflected on the terrible irony of his situation. He had been proved correct about everything. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but strategic disaster. America had united in fury rather than seeking peace. Japanese expansion had overextended the nation's capacity. The sleeping giant had awakened with terrible resolve. Every prediction Yamamoto had made before the war was coming true. But being right brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge that he had been forced to implement a strategy he knew was doomed. He had been the instrument of his nation's destruction, the architect of a war he knew Japan could not win. In April 1943, American code breakers intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, authorized an operation to intercept and kill Yamamoto. It was a controversial decision. Targeting an individual commander was unusual in modern warfare. But Yamamoto was not just any commander. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japanese military power, and possibly the most capable strategic mind in the Imperial Navy. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's aircraft was intercepted by American P-38 Lightning fighters over Bougainville. The Betty bomber carrying the Admiral was shot down, crashing into the jungle. Yamamoto died instantly, his body found still strapped to his seat, clutching his samurai sword. News of Yamamoto's death sent shockwaves through Japan. The emperor declared a day of national mourning. Yamamoto was elevated to the highest ranks posthumously. His funeral was attended by hundreds of thousands. He was remembered as a hero, a genius, a warrior who had struck a mighty blow against the arrogant Americans. But in his final writings, discovered after his death, Yamamoto revealed his true thoughts. In a letter to a trusted friend, never sent, he had written, "I fear that I will be remembered as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who brought America into the war. But I want history to know that I always opposed this conflict. I warned that we would awaken a sleeping giant. I predicted that we would face overwhelming retaliation. I knew from the beginning that we could not win. Yet duty demanded that I serve my nation, even when I believed my nation's course was suicidal. If my death can bring any wisdom to future generations, let it be this: Never underestimate your enemy, never overestimate your own strength, and never begin a war you cannot finish. The Pacific War would continue for more than 2 years after Yamamoto's death, growing ever more brutal and destructive. The island-hopping campaign brought American forces ever closer to Japan. The strategic bombing campaign devastated Japanese cities. The submarine blockade strangled the Japanese economy. And in August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing final, terrible proof of the industrial and scientific superiority Yamamoto had warned about. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The empire was dismantled. The military was dissolved. The nation that had sought to dominate Asia lay in ruins, occupied by the same Americans they had attacked that quiet Sunday morning in December 1941. Admiral Yamamoto had been both hero and prophet. He had planned the Pearl Harbor attack brilliantly and executed it flawlessly. And he had understood from the very beginning that it was the worst mistake Japan could possibly make. His genius had brought tactical victory. His wisdom had foreseen strategic disaster. His duty had compelled him to implement a plan he knew would doom his nation. In the end, he was right about everything, and that knowledge died with him in the jungles of Bougainville, a silent testimony to the tragedy of a brilliant mind trapped by history, honor, and the hubris of empire.